Domain 5 of the CompTIA Security Plus certification, Security Program Management and Oversight, is focused on governing and managing cybersecurity programs at an organizational level. This domain represents about 20% of your exam. In this lesson, we'll cover 6 major areas that form the foundation of security program management: security governance frameworks, risk management processes, third-party risk management, security compliance requirements, audits and assessments, and security awareness programs. Think of this domain as your executive briefing on cybersecurity management. While previous domains focused on technical implementation and operations, this domain is about managing security programs strategically, ensuring compliance, managing risks, and creating organizational security culture. You're learning to think like a security manager or executive who must balance security requirements with business objectives. Security governance provides the framework for making security decisions, establishing accountability, and ensuring security aligns with business objectives. Guidelines are recommended practices and suggestions for implementing security measures. They provide flexibility while offering direction on security best practices. You might see key phrases, obviously what we've just said, but you might also see suggested approaches or advisory recommendations in association with guidelines as we talk about understanding security governance and you go through the test on that. For policies, these are high-level statements that define organizations' security objectives and establish the framework for security decision-making. This is important to note. Policies are mandatory and enforceable. You might very likely have to remember that for the test. Policies are mandatory and enforceable. So key phrases associated with that would also be organizational requirements, mandatory statements, security objectives, executive directives, or enforceable requirements. And then you've got standards, which are specific mandatory requirements that define how security policies will be implemented. They provide detailed specifications and requirements. So you might see key phrases like detailed specifications, mandatory implementations, technical standards, required configurations. You might need to know how to distinguish between standards and policies for your Security Plus exam. Policies are equal to high-level, strategic what statements, broad, general statements of organizational intent, written by executive leadership, senior management, defining the what the organization wants to achieve, mandatory but not specific about how to implement, and usually short and high-level. Standards detail specific how requirements, specific technical requirements that implement policies written by technical teams or subject matter experts, defining how policies will be implemented, mandatory with detailed specifications and usually longer and more technical than policies. You might see key phrases that indicate policies such as the organization shall, or it is the policy of the company to. That obviously gives it away. All employees must, management requires, or broad statements about objectives or goals. So for standards, you might see password must meet minimum 12 characters, or encryption shall use AES 256. Remember, AES was symmetric as well, going back into a previous domain. Firewalls will be configured with. Systems must be patched within 30 days. Specific technical requirements or measurable criteria standards. So your memory trick, policy, principles with the P, broad, high-level principles, policy. Standard, specific, S for specific, detailed and technical. A policy, all sensitive data must be protected during transmission. A standard, all sensitive data must use TLS 1.3 encryption with minimum 256-bit key length and certificate validation. So then we have procedures, which are step-by-step instructions for performing specific security tasks for processes. Procedures provide operational guidance for consistent implementation, so step-by-step instructions. So standards got more technical than policies, but procedures really go into step by step. So that's your key phrase, step by step. Or you might see detailed processes, operational procedures, task instructions, or implementation steps. Then you have the external consideration, which are factors outside the organization that influence security governance, including regulations, industry requirements, and business partner demands. And so partner requirements, external mandates, regulatory requirements, compliance obligations. Industry standards, that's all external considerations. And then monitoring involves continuously observing compliance with governance requirements and measuring the effectiveness of security programs. So you'd have compliance monitoring, program effectiveness, governance metrics, performance metrics, and oversight activities. And then governance structures are the organizational frameworks that define roles, responsibilities, and decision-making authority for security governance. So governance framework, security committees, organizational structure, decision authority, reporting structures. Look for scenarios and key phrases involving those words. Then you have roles and responsibilities, which define who is accountable for various aspects of security governance and what their specific duties and authorities are. Job responsibilities, duty assignments, accountability assignments, authority delegation. Now, about 25% of Domain 5 is risk management, which involves systematically identifying, assessing, and managing security risks to acceptable levels while supporting business objectives. So companies do take risks and they make decisions about what kinds of risks they'll take. What is their risk tolerance? Are they able to take big risks or only small ones? Risk identification involves discovering and cataloging potential threats, vulnerabilities, and risk scenarios that could affect the organization. For exam questions about risk identification, look for scenarios involving discovering potential security risks. Watch for phrases like identifying risk, discovering threats, finding vulnerabilities, risk discovery, or threat identification. And then you have assessment, which involves evaluating identified risks to understand their likelihood, impact, and overall risk level to the organization. Associated phrases to know if assessment's going on here in your scenario, evaluating and measuring risks, impact analyses, likelihood assessment, risk measurement. And then analysis involves detailed examination of risks to understand their characteristics, causes, and potential consequences in greater depth. So cause analyses, consequence analyses, deep dive analyses, and register is a formal document that records all identified risks, their assessments, and the actions being taken to manage them. The risk register. On exam questions, risk registers involve formal documentation of risks and their management. So you want to look for scenarios involving risk documentation, risk tracking, formal risk records, risk database, or risk inventory. If the question focuses on documenting and tracking risks in a formal system, you're dealing with a register, a risk register. Might just be called a register, it might be called a risk register. And then here we are with tolerance, which defines the level of risk the organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives. So you've got acceptable risk, you've got risk appetite, tolerance levels, acceptable exposure, risk acceptance criteria. These are all key phrases to tie in when the question is talking about what is the risk tolerance of this organization, risk tolerance level. And then risk appetite, though, that's another thing. It might just be called appetite, it might be called risk appetite, is the organization's overall willingness to take risks in pursuit of business objectives. And it's often expressed in broad terms. So if you see risk willingness, overall risk approach, strategic risk acceptance, organizational risk culture, or risk philosophy, you're often looking at a question or a scenario that's involving discussing the organization's risk appetite. And then there are also risk strategies, and these are the approaches that the organization takes to manage the risks, including avoidance, mitigation, transfer, and acceptance. Now, if you ever see something that says risk strategy or even doesn't, but it talks about cybersecurity insurance, directly tie cybersecurity insurance to the risk strategy of transfer, because they're transferring the risk to somebody else by paying them to take that risk with the cybersecurity insurance. If you shut down a project because you don't like the risk, you're avoiding the risk. If you accept the risk, you might not even make any changes at all. If you mitigate the risk, you're saying, okay, there's a risk. What can we do to reduce our risk and continue moving forward. How can we make sure that we're okay? We'll mitigate the risk. We're not going to stop. We're not going to avoid it. We're not buying insurance, and we're not just accepting it as is. We're going to mitigate it. So these are your risk strategies. So you want to watch for phrases like risk treatment, management approaches, risk responses, mitigation strategies, or risk handling. And then risk reporting involves communicating risk information to stakeholders, including management boards and other relevant parties. So risk communication, stakeholder reporting, risk updates, management briefings, or risk status reports. Obviously, you're dealing with risk reporting. And then we have business impact analyses, which you might see as just BIA, or it might be spelled out, or both, which involves assessing the potential consequences of disruptions to business operations and identifying critical processes and resources. Exam questions about BIA look for scenarios involving assessing business disruption impacts. Watch for phrases like business impact, disruption analyses, critical processes, operational consequences, business continuity might be there. The section of questions associated with third-party risk is about 15% of Domain 5. Third-party risk management involves assessing and managing security risks introduced through relationships with vendors, suppliers, and business partners. The vendor assessment involves evaluating potential vendors' security posture. How strong is their security environment? What is their security posture? Vendor security capabilities, and risks before establishing this business relationship. That's the vendor assessment. So to clue you in that you're dealing with the vendor assessment scenario, you might see vendor evaluation, supplier assessment, partner review, security evaluation, or vendor vetting. If the question focuses on assessing vendors before working with them, then you're dealing with vendor assessment. And here we have selection, which involves choosing vendors based on their security capabilities, risk levels, and alignment with organizational requirements. So partner selection, vendor choice, provider choice, and so on. Maybe even vendor decisions. Agreements are contractual documents that define security requirements, responsibilities, and expectations for third-party relationships. Watch for vendor contracts, security agreements, contractual requirements, service agreements, or partner contracts. Monitoring involves continuously observing third-party compliance with security requirements and performance expectation. You might see compliance tracking for performance monitoring, continual assessment, or vendor oversight. And questionnaires are structured assessment tools used to evaluate vendor security practices, capabilities, and compliance status. You want to watch for phrases like security questionnaires, of course, that gives it away. Assessment surveys, vendor evaluation, security surveys, or compliance questionnaires. And then last in this part is the rules of engagement, which define the terms, conditions, and boundaries for how third parties can interact with organizational systems and data. You might see terms like access boundaries, operational limits, or access conditions. And then 15% of Domain 5 is security compliance, which involves ensuring the organization meets all applicable legal, regulatory, and contractual security requirements. In here we have compliance reporting, which involves documenting and communicating the organization's adherence to compliance requirements to relevant authorities and stakeholders. Adherence reporting, audit reports, compliance status, and so on alert you to the fact that you might be on a compliance reporting question or one that involves that. And you've got the consequences of non-compliance, which are the potential negative outcomes that can result from failing to meet compliance requirements, including fines, money, legal action, and business impact. You see scenarios involving compliance penalties, regulatory fines, legal consequences, business impact, or compliance violations. Monitoring in here involves continuously observing compliance status to identify potential compliance issues before they become violations. So if you see compliance tracking or ongoing monitoring, assessment, status monitoring, or continuous compliance, you're dealing with monitoring. Privacy involves protecting personal and sensitive information in accordance accordance with privacy laws and regulations such as GDPR, CCPA, and HIPAA. If you see the phrases personal data protection, PII protection, privacy regulations, data privacy, or privacy laws, you should know that privacy is a part of this scenario question. And then another 15% of Domain 5 is audits and assessments, which provide independent evaluation of security programs, controls, and compliance status. So understanding attestation. This involves formal statements or certifications about the organization's compliance status or security posture, often provided by independent parties. You might see compliance certification, formal statements, attestation reports, certification statements, or compliance attestation. For internal audits, these are evaluations conducted by the organization's own audit team to assess compliance, controls, effectiveness, and program performance. You'll see internal evaluation, self-assessment, organizational audit, internal review, or company audit team. And external audits are evaluations conducted by independent third parties to provide objective assessment of compliance controls and security posture. So instead of internal audit, you would see independent audit, third-party assessment, external evaluation, independent review, outside auditors. And then penetration testing, which involves authorized simulated attacks against systems to identify vulnerabilities and assess the effectiveness of security controls. So look for scenarios involving authorized testing, simulated attacks, security testing, ethical hacking, or controlled attacks. And if the question focuses on testing security through authorized attack simulations, you are dealing with penetration testing. Now, about 10% of Domain 5 is security awareness. Security awareness programs educate users about security threats, safe practices, and their role in maintaining organizational security. Phishing training involves educating users about phishing attacks and teaching them how to identify and respond to suspicious messages. Watch for phrases like phishing education, email security training, suspicious message training, phishing awareness, or email threat training. Anomalous behavior recognition involves training users to identify and report unusual activities or behaviors that might indicate security incidents. If you see key phrases in your question in the scenario on behavior monitoring or suspicious activity reporting, user guidance involves providing users with clear instructions and best practices for maintaining security in their daily work activities. Reporting is establishing processes for users to report security incidents, suspicious activities, and potential threats. Look for the terms associated with reporting. Monitoring the tracking of effective security awareness programs and measuring user behavior changes and program impact. Look for words about measurement and assessment and awareness. Some key exam tips are management versus technical focus. The Domain 5 is about managing security programs, not implementing technical controls. It focuses on governance, oversight, and strategic management rather than technical details. And remember the logical sequence, the risk management process flow: identify, assess, analyze, treat, which could be avoid, mitigate, transfer, or accept, then monitor and report. Each step builds on the previous ones. For risk management scenarios, identify which phase of the process is being addressed. Early phases focus on discovery and assessment, and later phases focus on treatment and monitoring. And understand that compliance is about meeting external requirements, while security is about protecting the organization. They overlap, but they have different drivers and objectives. Third-party risk management follows a life cycle of assessment, selection, contracting, monitoring, and termination. Each phase has specific activities and controls. Understand the relationship: policies that are high level, standards with specific requirements, procedures that are step by step, and guidelines that are recommendations, as each serves a different purpose. Let's look at our dot connecting, discuss a few scenarios to reinforce these concepts before we go. A company is implementing a new data privacy regulation that requires specific protection measures for customer data, and they need to ensure compliance while managing associated risks and costs. So here we see this scenario involves security compliance of meeting regulatory requirements. It involves risk management, assessing compliance risks and treatment options. It involves policies and procedures implementing the required protection measures. And it involves monitoring the tracking compliance status and reporting demonstrating compliance to regulators. The next scenario is a healthcare organization is selecting a new cloud service provider to handle patient data. They need to ensure the provider meets security requirements and can demonstrate ongoing compliance. So we note that this scenario involves third-party risk management with the vendor assessment and selection. It involves vendor agreements with defining security requirements in contracts. It involves external audits with reviewing provider compliance certifications and monitoring for ongoing oversight of provider security performance, and privacy compliance, ensuring HIPAA and other healthcare regulations are met. And finally, a company has experienced several security incidents related to employee actions and wants to improve their security culture through education and awareness. The scenario involves security awareness training, phishing training, specific education about email-based attacks, user guidance providing clear security procedures, anomalous behavior recognition, teaching employees to spot suspicious activities, and monitoring and reporting, measuring program effectiveness and incident reporting. Domain 5 provides the strategic and management knowledge needed to govern cybersecurity programs effectively. Going into security governance frameworks that provide structure, accountability, and decision-making authority for security programs. Risk management processes that systematically identify, assess, and manage security risks to acceptable levels. Third-party risk management approaches for safely working with vendors, suppliers, and business partners. Security compliance requirements and how to meet regulatory, legal, and contractual obligations. Audit and assessment programs that provide the independent validation of security programs and controls. And security awareness programs that educate users and build organizational security culture. These management concepts work together to create effective security governance at the organizational level. Good security program management balances security requirements with business objectives while ensuring compliance and managing risks appropriately. Remember that security program management is ultimately about enabling business success while maintaining appropriate security posture. The best security programs support both objectives rather than hindering them, and effective security leaders understand both security and business requirements. Security governance requires ongoing attention and adaptation as threats evolve, regulations change, and business needs shift. Successful security programs are dynamic and responsive while maintaining consistent protective measures and governance frameworks. When you take the practice tests at the end of this course in Section 6, make sure you take advantage of reading through the explanations for why things are correct and incorrect. And as you scroll down, there's also additional information in an overall explanation. These practice tests should do more than just test your knowledge. They should also be an instructional guide for deepening your understanding of all of the objectives associated with the CompTIA Security Plus version 7 exam.